Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Lady Justice Talks, where curiosity meets law. Today, you're here with your host, Anita, and
Lucille. I am a first-year representative here at WILA, and I'm also first-year major for Law and Society. And a part of what I do as a first-year rep is that I go from department to just experience what it's like. So next year, when I'm in my second year and my second year in WILA, I get to choose what department I want to be in.
that sounds so fun. Nice. And today's episode is about the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And here we are with our beautiful guest, Amber. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Amber. I am a third-year Law and Society student here at York University, and I am a Social Justice and Advocacy Coordinator. So I'm in the Social Justice Department, and ultimately my role is to coordinate different events for social justice. We had an intersectionality panel. I helped coordinate with that. We had an Indigenous law panel. Essentially, we were helping with outreach.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, would you like to just to familiar the audience with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Just tell us what it's about. Explain to us.
For sure. So essentially, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is an entrenched Bill of Rights within our Constitution. And what that does is it protects a certain amount of rights that Canada has deemed fundamental to protect within Canadian society, such as freedom of expression, religion, equality rights, entrenching Indigenous rights as well. And that came from the 1960s Bill of Rights. Initially, it was just a federal statute, and it was not above the Constitution. And right now, the Charter, essentially what it does is, because it's entrenched, now it's a part of the Constitution, which means it's a supreme form of law.
Okay.
So all other laws that are beneath it, such as federal statutes, provincial and municipal laws, have to abide by the Constitution and the Charter.
Okay, that's actually pretty interesting. And I'm not gonna lie to you, that is a pretty rare interest. Like, I haven't heard that many people say that they're interested in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Can you just tell us, like, what makes you so fascinated by it and what draws you to it?
For sure. So when I was actually in high school, I was taking law courses because obviously I didn't really want to go into STEM. I'm bad at math. So I was like, you know what?
It's okay, same.
So I was like, you know what? I kind of like law. And growing up, I was really into advocacy, social rights, human rights. So then when I was in my high school law class, we started talking about criminal law. And as interesting as that was, I was like, okay, this is cool, but you know what? Maybe another aspect of law. And then we started talking about the Charter and the Constitution briefly. And I thought, oh, I actually really enjoy this. So then when I enrolled in the Law and Society program, I found that the socio-legal studies really zone in on the Charter.
Yeah.
And then since then, I've been doing a lot of legal research pertaining to the Charter, especially because a lot of our readings do pertain to the Charter, how it affects equality rights in society, how society is affected by the Constitution and law in itself. So I found myself really enjoying learning a little bit more about it. So then afterwards, I would go out on my own and just find some case law, read up on it to see how, just to see how society is changing in terms of like the common law practice.
Yeah.
And then I also joined mooting. Mooting really zones in too on the Charter because they use Supreme Court cases.
Yeah.
And when you go to the appellate court, it's usually because your rights were violated. You find that something in the Charter was completely violated. Oh, one of my rights was infringed upon. And ultimately, when you're mooting, you use that. And since then, I've been really enjoying it.
Okay, that's interesting. Actually, mooting. We might have another episode on that, so stay tuned. And just taking opportunity. And then, so that's Honestly, when you said high school, law classes in high school, that kind of brought me back because I also did the same, and that was the first time I got like familiar with the Charter of Rights as well, and it was really interesting, like with all the subsections and all this stuff it talks about.
Yes.
I'm not a law and society major, so I haven't really studied about that stuff since then, but you have, right?
Yes, I have. So, Amber, since we're both Law and Society students, I have something to ask. Do you think that understanding and knowing the charter should be reserved for law students only, or should everyone learn about it?
I think in terms of a very basic understanding, it should not just be a law student thing. I think it should expand because it's very important to understand what rights and what freedoms you have, because oftentimes if an individual doesn't know, and there's actually a lot of evidence in Australia with this too, people are taken advantage of by law enforcement because they don't know what their rights are.
Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of law enforcement can use someone's lack of knowledge and understanding of their rights to infringe on them, because ultimately when you don't understand something, how do you know what rights you have? So in terms of that, I believe everybody should have a good understanding, but in terms of like a broader in-depth analysis of exactly what the charter is, it should be focused on scholars to look at how laws are affected by the Constitution and by the charter, and how we can better our legal system with the charter. So from a scholarly aspect of it, it should be law students and scholars, but basic understanding everyone should
Because
know.
it does cover like the basic rights of human beings, right?
Exactly.
And you said like because they could take advantage of people that are not aware of their basic human rights,
Yes.
living in Canada and whatnot. So, on a personal note, would you say, do you like, has there been a moment in your life where the Canadian Charter of Rights has helped you, like played a key role in your life, or in like protecting your rights, or have you seen it like firsthand protect somebody else, help somebody else?
So I think firsthand, I have seen the charter protecting a lot of rights as it pertains to religious freedom, because as of right now, the religious freedoms are being called into question, especially in Quebec with one of the bills they passed in 2019.
Yeah.
It's very important and crucial to understand what rights you do have and how you're protected by them when it comes to practicing religion, because as of right now, Quebec passed a bill, and this bill essentially says that anyone who works in the public services, such as teachers, nurses, police officers, cannot wear any signs of religious.
Yeah, I've heard of that too.
Yes, and because of that, it calls into question, is this a freedom of religion, or is this a freedom from religion? Because the way that Quebec passed it was they used the notwithstanding clause to pass this unlawful bill because they know it overrides the charter. So now people cannot go to the appellate courts to appeal this because the notwithstanding clause was used. So therefore, you can't really do anything about it, which is so unfortunate, and it's very disheartening too, because
It is, yeah.
you have a right to religion and assembly as well. And when you use the notwithstanding clause to override a religious freedom, it's very disheartening when it comes to Canadian values, because we truly do value our charter, and the fact that one of these fundamental values is being overridden for 5 years, it's very disheartening.
It is. It really is.
I agree. So, you touched upon religion, and I'd like to go further into that. Do you have any more cases, I guess, that would,
Like specific cases?
Yeah, specific cases that Canada is dealing with today?
Yes, so Quebec is definitely one of them, but I will actually go back to the past a little bit, and I will talk about, there's one case, and I forget the name of it, but essentially it was questioning how courts can truly evaluate religious freedoms, because in this case, an individual came to the courts because there were a lot of complaints from his building. I'll just refer to it as a homeowners association because that's the closest parallel that I can find to that. So the homeowners association and the building as a collective were arguing that this individual could not build a structure that he deemed to be religious for a holiday, because according to him, it is his duty when he's practicing his religion to build this structure during said holiday because it's a religious thing. It gets it'll get torn down afterwards, but the HOA ended up saying, well, there's a subsection in your contract which states that you cannot build anything, you can't have anything on your porch or on your balcony. So he felt that his rights were truly infringed upon because he felt that it was his religious duty to build this structure. However, most of these people in the building were of the same faith, and they were saying as well, we don't really practice that. So now it calls into question the extent the courts can evaluate religious freedoms, because ultimately in the decision of that case, they said it's not up to the courts to decide how to practice a religion. It is up to them to essentially objectively evaluate the case that they have at bar. And when there's a collective that's actually saying, well, no, we don't practice it like this, the courts are saying, how can we evaluate this without infringing on their own individual rights? Because ultimately, everyone does have the individual right to practice.
Yeah, of course.
How can the courts and how can the legal institutions properly evaluate what is and isn't a part of their practice? So that's something that the courts should really consider too, because ultimately, everybody has their own interpretation of religion.
Yeah.
But the courts have to be objective and neutral when evaluating it. However, that's very difficult to do because courts are never 100% neutral either.
Yeah, no. And this actually reminds me of the freedom of expression, which is also really touched upon in the Canadian Charter of Rights. So I also wanted to know your thoughts on that and if you have any notes about that.
For sure. So as of right now, we have seen quite a bit about freedom of expression, especially with the pandemic. We had those major protests in Ottawa and across the nation, the trucker convoy, called into question freedom of expression because ultimately, everyone has a right to express themselves. That is correct. Again, it's another question of how far can it go? Because ultimately, there is a clause in the Charter, which is called the reasonable limits, which questions the justification of state intrusion in the event someone claims that there is an unlawful constitutional infringement in their case. So everyone does have a right to freedom of expression. However, oftentimes people get this confused because there's, again, that limit of how far it can go. Yes, exactly, how far it can go.
Especially since everybody's, different and they have different levels of how they express themselves. It's very...
Exactly. So that's very difficult to consider because more case law needs to be included when evaluating it because it's very difficult. However, at the same time, people express themselves completely differently. As long as an individual isn't harming someone else, that's essentially how most people see it is, if I'm not harming someone, then it's okay. But it can cause damage too. So you have a right to express yourselves, but the courts can intervene when they find it to be a reasonable limit, of course. Because again, that's a very difficult subject to talk about. Just because there are different interpretations, there's so much case law that completely varies from case to case. Essentially, the way that they view it is the totality of the circumstances. And what they do is they just evaluate all of the facts that are given to them to conclusively determine whether or not it was violated. Because if it's unlawful censorship, if it's like censorship, that's a different story. Censorship, that is, to an extent, that is a violation. However, courts tend to justify certain things, which is understandable if it's like hate speech.
Mm-hmm.
That is a reasonable limit to when it comes to expression. But if it's something like expressing yourself on a vacation somewhere, or like you're talking about something that's so near and dear to you, and then all of a sudden you get that notification on Instagram or Snapchat saying, hey, you know, your account is flagged.
Yeah, a lot of people, like, when you said that limit, that also, like, or how far you can go, that also reminded me of freedom of speech. I feel like a lot of people mistake freedom of speech as, like, when you said that hate, like when you use the word hate, it automatically reminded me of that. A lot of people use freedom of speech as saying that they have the right to say anything.
Yes. So that is one of the biggest misconceptions about freedom of expression, because there's freedom of speech.
It ties in with freedom of expression, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And oftentimes people will speak freely, which is totally fine, but then when it comes to hate speech or really, really negative, nasty comments, that's where people get it confused by saying, oh, it's my right to freely express myself. It's my right to speak freely. So technically speaking, most people tend to intertwine the two when they're completely separate.
Yeah.
Like, you have a freedom to express yourself in your identity, whereas you do have a right to speak as well. While most people do consider them intertwined, it's totally different.
Yeah, that's why, what was it called? Civil protests? I think those are the best kind of protests because they're not bothering
Peaceful
protests.
protests.
Peaceful protests.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the word. Like, they're not really bothering anybody, but you're also still getting your message across and what you want to say, how you want to express yourself.
Yes.
You're doing that.
Because freedom of expression also includes freedom of assembly.
Yes.
Which is where peaceful protests come in. Whereas freedom of speech is completely different, because you have a right to speak. We're speaking on a podcast right now. We have the right to do so. You also have a right to peacefully protest. You have a right to express that's a form of expression, is the freedom of assembly. That's the common misconception when it comes to the two of them.
People often mistake them as...
Yes,
okay.
People all the time mistake freedom of expression as freedom of speech. When somebody says my freedom of speech was taken, they often say my freedom of expression.
That makes a lot of sense.
So thank you so much for touching up on that. So I have a question. So the Charter guarantees equality rights. How well do you think Canada is doing ensuring equal rights for all its citizens?
That's actually a really good question. So thank you for that. In terms of equality, there's a difference between equality and equity. As of right now, the way that Canada views equality is very neutral. So essentially, when we look at an individual, you don't look at the different intersecting characteristics of an individual where like you ultimately just view them as a person. So that's how Canada is dealing with equality, whereas equity considers an intersectional approach where they look at the individual as a whole. So instead of looking at it as man, woman, you look at it as women. You look at their characteristics, their sexual orientation, etc. You look at the person as a whole rather than looking at the individual as just a person. So in terms of equality, the neutral approach is still a little bit of a hit or miss, because ultimately we do see a lot of case law where there was unfortunate police interception or courts are viewing individuals based on their racial identity rather than the intersecting approach. So we still have a long way to go in terms of that. And again, the difference between equality and equity, it's really important. I personally believe that Canada should be looking at individuals more on an equitable approach, because ultimately, when you look at, for example, man or woman, there's a theory that suggests that when you look at them, especially when you look at women in particular, there's a certain identity associated specifically with a woman. And it fails to include like marginalized groups of women, such as like indigenous women or two-spirited women, LGBTQ plus women. It fails to look at other aspects of women, thinking that everyone needs the same thing, when in fact everybody does need different things.
Yeah.
So that's where like intersectionality.
Is it more like we want equal opportunity versus like a lot of people mistake that when they say they want equality, it's not about like, because like people are obviously different, even men like they're different among themselves too. It's more like knowing that you have equal opportunity to get to the same place.
Yes.
Is what's really important.
Yes, because there are some groups that do need better access to equity in terms of getting to that level playing field. Because again, going back, like indigenous two-spirited women or individuals may need different things in comparison to a heterosexual woman.
Yeah.
So that's where like the marginalization plays, unfortunately, a very prominent role in the discrimination of these groups, because all need different resources in comparison.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and since you were talking about, like, previously when you were talking about hate, I'm so on. When you were talking about hate and also the charter adapting to modern challenges and all that, that also reminds me of like digital privacy, which is a big thing in today's thing.
Yes.
And so how do you see like the charter like adapting to modern challenges such as these like online hate speech, like as you touched upon, and then digital privacy in the future or even now?
Absolutely. So that's something that legal institutions are still asking themselves, right? Because in a society where we're evolving to the digital realm, it's very important to consider how the charter can apply, because ultimately everybody has a right to privacy. And then it also questions lawful state intrusion, because there's always going to be some form of organized crime, whether it's in person, whether it's online. As of right now, online, there's a lot of issues when it comes to digital organized crime, hackers and scamming, things like that. So it calls into question how police can lawfully intervene in this. And there's a lot of case precedents, actually. One of the cases I just mooted was R.V. Campbell, 2024, and it talks about how police can intercept text messages by impersonating the individual who owns the phone.
Yeah.
So I'll actually talk a little bit about that case because it's so confusing.
Of course, yeah.
So an individual, his name was Mr. Gamey, was arrested because he was a known drug dealer in Guelph. And when police arrested him, they had a warrant, so they seized his phone. And then Gamey's phone ended up lighting up with text messages from someone named Dew. And apparently this was suggesting a drug transaction. So police intercepted by impersonating Gamey because they believed that Dew was going to be selling a drug that was very deadly and unfortunately like an epidemic in Canadian society, heroin laced with fentanyl. Oh. So for 2 hours, they were texting Dew to try and get this transaction to occur.
Oh, they were trying to see like if he would like slip up or say something specific about the...
So they were actually trying to get him to meet with them.
Okay.
So that way they could get they could seize the drugs and arrest him for possession of narcotics. And then Dew felt that his rights were violated. His Section 8 rights to privacy were violated. However, the Supreme Court of Canada actually dismissed the appeal because they found that in this case, police did lawfully act within their rights and their constitutional duties because they reasonably felt that this was an exigent circumstance under Section 11.7 of the CDSA, which is the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act. And it really just goes to show whether or not police can impersonate someone on a third party's device.
Yeah.
So that really called into question how police can intervene when it comes to online crime, because there's more cases too, like the case of Bajkovic, which is very popular, where certain information that seems surface level, like an IP address, has the potential to divulge very sensitive biographical information on an individual. So it's obviously like we're still trying to look at it and balance it. But as of right now, the courts really do have to evaluate how the charter can apply online.
Yeah, because it's also like it's not like recent, but like the modern world, like online presence of everybody, like social media, all that is developing a lot, especially like in the most recent years. So I do also think it's pretty like they're still trying to understand what they're supposed to do exactly.
And there's actually a survey that was sent out to a lot of Canadian officers from different regions across the country. It was a survey about their policing and whatnot. And a lot of the feedback that came back from the officers was they feel that they don't actually have the knowledge on how to properly go about crime online. And they feel that within their training, they should have better knowledge on how to handle this, because there's so many cases now that are coming up that question all of the information that we put out online that may seem surface level. How much of it does it have the potential to divulge that really sensitive information?
Yeah.
And if so, how do they lawfully go about it?
Yeah.
So as you were talking about cases, can you share any notable cases or examples where the charter has been used to challenge a law or policy, and what impact did it have on Canadian society?
Yes. So I'll actually use another case that I've mooted before. So this case in particular is the case of power, and it questions parliamentary, it's like supremacy and sovereignty. And essentially in this case, Power was affected by a law that resulted in him losing his job, and he ended up getting a criminal record. But Parliament ended up revoking this law, and he was arguing that his constitutional rights were infringed upon because they weren't striking it off the record, because he was arrested under a law that was then deemed to be unlawful. So this actually calls into question the extent of Parliament's immunity and whether or not that an individual can subject Parliament to these damages. So he ended up winning the case ultimately, and the court did conclude that there is a limited immunity. Parliament does have a right to a certain level of discretion when it comes to making laws, because obviously it's part of the democratic process and their constitutional duties to create these laws. However, when it comes to imposing a law or even creating a law that's deemed to be unconstitutional, then an individual does have a right to claim charter damages. So that's where policymaking really comes into play, because it demonstrates that Parliament is not absolutely immune, which means that they are subjected to the charter and damages in the event that a right is infringed upon.
So, like, hypothetically speaking, do you think there is anything in the charter that could be changed or is flexible enough to be changed?
So changing the charter itself is very difficult to do.
Yeah, and I know it's a big question to ask, because it's like, but like just generally.
In terms of changing it, not necessarily, but I would say using case law makes it a little bit more flexible, because obviously when someone's disputing it and they're using case law, they do have that right to use case law and dissenting opinions to help further their submissions or their arguments to the court. So it adds that little bit of flexibility, because it shows that in the common law practice, you can go back to case law, you can use it, and you can better interpret it. Because oftentimes in cases, there could be a majority opinion where they would dismiss the appeal, and then there's a dissenting opinion which would say, oh, I would allow the appeal because of X, Y, Z. So then that dissenting opinion can end up having a lot more flexibility in the future as things evolve. So that way, when there's more cases coming up and there's more opinions that are similar to that one dissent, it really helps better interpret. So in terms of flexibility, not really, but interpretation, absolutely. Because ultimately when it comes to the charter, because it's so difficult to change what's in the charter and the Constitution as well, the interpretation is what's really important. And case law plays such a fundamental role in how we understand the charter because it's real world situations that have come up. And obviously when it comes to protecting rights, it's so important to have a better understanding for the future of what it is, how it can be interpreted, because there are some sections that are so ambiguous and they're so broad that is very difficult to narrow down. Like Section 7 is life, liberty, and security of the person. And technically speaking, some women's rights are under Section 7 because it was a life, liberty, and security of the person situation that has arose. And that's where a lot of women's rights have stemmed from because of the broad interpretations. So sometimes the purposeful, overly broad interpretations can help when it comes to better understanding rights.
Yeah, and all of this reminds me back to your fascination with the Charter of Rights. And so I was just wondering, generally, is there anything else that you would like to add on? Because all your answers to all of our questions have been chef's kiss. Like, they've been perfect. Like I knowledge right now. I feel very knowledgeable. But I also love the cases that you mentioned. Are there like any other cases you want to talk about or anything else specifically?
That's a good question. Obviously, like
general question.
I honestly think that the Bajkovic case is so fascinating, especially because of the digital age question you asked. It's so important now to consider how much of a right we have online to privacy and certain things online too, because honestly, I didn't even know what an IP address is.
Really?
No. Like, when it comes to tech, I am so useless.
I'm not your girl.
Like, no, absolutely not. I'm not a tech girl. So then finding out about an IP address, and especially how the case played out too. There was fraudulent activity online from some liquor store that was, I don't know what it was online, and then police knew about this. So what they did was they went to a third-party vendor who was holding all of the credit card information from the fraudulent activity, and they did this without a warrant, and they obtained all of the IP addresses of the individuals. Afterwards, they then obtained a warrant to go to these individuals' houses and stuff. But as it turns out, what the IP address can divulge is where they live, who lives in the house, and what device it came from specifically. So something that seems so surface level has that potential, and I didn't know that. So I thought that was so interesting because there's so much about technology that most people don't know about.
Yeah, I know.
Especially like if you're not into tech.
Yeah.
So that really leaves you to question, how much of a right to privacy do I actually have? Especially like when it comes to using social media. And ultimately, the Supreme Court did decide that IP addresses are technically similar to a social insurance number.
Yeah, because it is your address of like where everything, all your networks are connected, if I'm not wrong. Yeah,
your networks, literally your entire internet history possible. Like, that's scary. Imagine somebody police officers not getting a warrant, and then all of a sudden they see all of your online activity.
Also,
would you really want police to see that? I don't think so.
Would you want anybody to see that? No. Also, all these cases are posted on the Supreme Court of Canada website.
Yes.
So if anybody wants to read more about these type of cases that Amber is talking about, you can find those on the...
You can find them on the Supreme Court of Canada website, or you can find it on CanLII as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Wow, that was great. Do you have any more final questions?
No.
Everything was perfect?
Everything was perfect.
Yeah.
Amber was amazing.
It was.
Yeah.
She just flowed. honestly made our
I
job
know.
easier. We just have to ask the
thank you.
questions and like listen and learn. Listen and learn.
Listen and learn.
Listen and learn.
Just smile and nod.
Mm-hmm.
Just smile. Yes.
No, I have too much knowledge on it, but I think it's such a valuable subject that everyone should look into.
No, definitely. Especially since it talks about our basic human rights.
Yeah.
Exactly.
As simple as that.
And if you want to go into law school too, I think it's such a valuable subject to look into.
Yeah, 100%. Please know your rights if you're going to law school. That's for me too, as well. Anyways. Are there any last notes that you would like to add?
I think I'm good. I think I got most of my points across.
Perfect.
Thank you for letting me ramble.
Of course. We loved having you here today.
Thank you.
How did you feel about hosting?
It felt nice, actually.
She was nervous in the beginning.
I was very nervous.
She did so well.
You're so
Stop
cute.
it.
She's like talking in such a soft voice. And then I'm like, yeah, guys.
I'm just like screaming into the microphone.
No, you were both amazing. Thank you so much for helping me host
Oh,
this
thank you.
episode. And I hope all of you guys enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for being with us for another episode. How many times am I going to say episode? Anyways. And yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned for our next episodes. Bye.
Bye.